All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight here at The Volume. Happy Thursday, everybody. Hope all of you guys are having an incredible week so far. We are also live on AMP, so if you're watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast feeds, don't forget that AMP is the very first place that you guys can get these shows. We're continuing our top 25 players the last 25 years today with number 17, 16, 15, and 14. You guys know the drill. Before we get started, subscribe to The Volume's YouTube channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Follow me on Twitter at _JasonLT so you guys don't miss any show announcements. And if for whatever reason you miss one of these videos and you can't get back over to YouTube to finish, don't forget you can find them wherever you get your podcasts under Hoops Tonight. All right, let's talk some basketball. So a couple things from the comments on the last video. First of all, shout out to Muneeb 2001 or MUNEEB 2001. You were the person who guessed the two players ahead on the list that are not champions, and Steve Nash and Allen Iverson, so good guess there. Also, still several of you guys who are very upset with Chris Paul not being on the list, and I talked a little bit about this yesterday, but the consistent theme that I'm seeing from people is saying that, talking about rings culture and how that messes with analysis, and then just basically struggling to see the difference between evaluating players in a vacuum versus what actually happened, right? So, I want to differentiate between those two because there's value in both, right? Like, for instance, it's like with my top 25 players in the league this year, right? If I'm evaluating players in a vacuum, I'm probably going to have Luka at 3 or 4. I'd still go Jokic 1 and Steph 2, but I'd have either Giannis at 3 and Luka at 4 or Luka at 3 and Giannis at 4, right? If I'm evaluating based on the future. But that's not the purpose of that specific list for me. That list for me is more of like an award ceremony. That list is like, let's talk about what actually happened. And even though I do view Luka Doncic in a vacuum as one of the 5 best basketball players in the world, there were 9 guys this season that I thought deserved more credit for what they accomplished actually in the actual basketball games that took place, right? And so that's just kind of a difference between those two concepts. As a general manager, if I have an option in an open draft to take Jimmy Butler or Luka Doncic or year 21 LeBron James or Luka Doncic, I'm obviously taking Luka, but I'm not operating in a vacuum. That list for me is more of an award ceremony. If you guys did a list, you might look at it more as an in a vacuum type of situation. And if we were discussing the list in that sort of situation, I'm obviously going to rank my list very differently. Chris Paul is obviously a better basketball player than guys like Chauncey Billups or Jason Kidd, right? Or even Tony Parker. But Jason Kidd, it's more of a toss-up. But at least with Chauncey Billups and Tony Parker, you're taking Chris Paul, right? And if we were operating in a vacuum, then yeah, I would have Chris Paul that high. But again, mine's more of an award ceremony. Mine is more talking about what actually happened. And those guys have more impressive resumes to me in terms of top-end accomplishments as it pertains to winning basketball games at the highest level. Obviously, if I took Tony Parker and swapped him out for Chris Paul is going to be a multiple-time champion right now. But that I just want to differentiate between those two. It's not like I'm saying Chris Paul's not top 25 because I'm just trying to shit on who he was as a basketball player. That's not what I'm saying. I'm literally talking about what actually happened. And I see there's value in that. I think that in terms of reflecting on life, we have a tendency to try to talk about what could have been, right? Like even me personally, there are times when I look back and think about some decisions I made in my early 20s that directly affected my basketball career. And sometimes I think about what might have happened had I done something differently, and that's great and all, but that's not what happened. What actually happened is what actually happened, and I'm here where I am as a result, and my college basketball story is a product of that, right? And that's set in stone. I can't go back and change that, and that is the reality. We can talk about what might have happened with Chris Paul if he got an opportunity to be the second best player on a team while he was in his prime, but unfortunately, we didn't really get that option. And so we don't get to have that data, and there is no trophy at the end of that road. And so again, if it helps you guys, one of the easiest ways to put it is this list is more of an award ceremony. This is a chance to look back at what actually happened in NBA history and focus on that rather than talking about hypotheticals. You'll notice we add the big what if so that we can talk about hypotheticals over the course of this. And again, like Chris Paul's still active. Chris Paul's a player that I've talked about a lot on my show. Again, like I said yesterday, you guys know how highly I view him in terms of his actual basketball talent when he was at his peak. But just for the criteria I set up on this list, it came up differently. If I was evaluating the top 25 players of the last 25 years, just based solely on in a vacuum performance, yeah, guys like Joel Embiid aren't going to make the list, right? It's going to be a little bit different. You're going to evaluate guys a little bit different, but that's not how it works. So hopefully that gives you guys, again, like I said yesterday, this is attempt number 3 to explain it. So we'll see. Hopefully that goes, it helps you guys understand a little bit better. So number 17, Anthony Davis. By the way, the first NBA game I ever went to was to see Anthony Davis. I just watched games on TV as a kid and never actually bothered to go to a game. And then I finally did, I think it was in 2015 or 16, and I watched Anthony Davis when he was with the Pelicans. He was the second best player on a championship team in 2020, 4-time first-team All-NBA, 6-time All-NBA overall, 4-time All-Defense, and he led the league in blocks 3 times, blocks per game, I should say. I put his prime down as 2015 to the present. In that stretch, he averaged 26 points, 11 rebounds, and 3 assists per game to go with 2.3 blocks per game on 59% true shooting. And in the playoffs, he averaged 26, 11, and 3 with 2.2 blocks per game on 62% true shooting. I think Anthony Davis, like when we look back on this era, his claim to fame is he's the best defensive player of this era when he's healthy. There are more accomplished defensive players, right? Guys like Kawhi Leonard, Draymond Green that have won more awards and have had more recognition in terms of what they can do. Rudy Gobert is another guy that's got a lot of regular season recognition. But when it comes down to actual defensive peak, I have never seen a player in this era reach the individual defensive ceiling that Anthony Davis reached in the 2020 playoffs. And he was just only a small level below that in this past postseason. When it comes to actual defensive impact on a game by one single player, or on a series by one single player, I don't think anybody in this era has touched what Anthony Davis has been able to do, and I think that's what he'll be remembered for. His archetype, he's one of the few unicorns to come into the NBA in this century. He doesn't really resemble any player who came before. Ridiculous length. He's 6'10", but he has a 7'6" wingspan. He's super quick feet and good hand-eye coordination. He handles the ball really well, moves his feet really well. He's not clumsy. Great hands, catches, and finishes everything around the rim. Like I said earlier, best defender of this era, best rim protector in this era. As a matter of fact, if we remove Walker Kessler, who only has one season, no player in the entire NBA has averaged more blocks per game than Anthony Davis since he came into the league in 2015. He's also a good switch defender. We look at situations like the semifinals this year and him getting a couple of stops on Steph Curry, and even stretching into the regular season the last couple of years, you see guards like get a switch onto Anthony Davis and they think they can beat him off the dribble, like Cade Cunningham did it a couple times in Detroit, or Tyrese Halliburton did it this year with the Pacers. Did you guys get Anthony Davis on a switch and they think they have an advantage and they just don't? He's too quick and his defensive IQ is too high and his physical tools are too great. Also ran the floor really well before his injuries. I think I've been critical of his ability to keep up in the transition pace of the game in recent years. Total Swiss Army knife on offense. He's a great roll man. He's got an arsenal of little short jumpers and pop shots in the lane, floaters. I think he's the best vertical spacer in the league. I think if there's a guy that you're talking about throwing lobs above the rim, there's nobody better than Anthony Davis. As far as ISOs and post-ups, he's a good ISO post-up player, but not as good as he's capable of being. He was pretty good this year, well over a point per possession in a post-up situation this year. He actually shot 61% on hook shots this year. That's kind of his bread and butter out of the post. He's got a good baseline rip-through move as he tries to kind of bury the defender under the basket and take a power dribble to get back. He's good at drawing fouls. But nothing got close to what he reached in the 2020 postseason. Outside of that, he's been kind of somewhat average compared to his peers as a shot creator. That 2020 postseason, though, is an interesting little window of time, which we'll come back to in a little bit. His crowning achievement was he was the second best player on the 2020 Lakers. And not just a usual second best player like we've talked about in other elements of this list. Like Anthony Davis was a bona fide top tier superstar in that playoff run. Like LeBron James was better than him in that playoff run, but only because he was the best player in the world. I thought LeBron was the best player in the world that season, but I ranked Anthony Davis at 4 that season. I basically went LeBron, Steph, KD, and then Anthony Davis at that point. And then I think I had Giannis at 5, if I remember correctly at that point in time. But Anthony Davis was a number 2, but only in relation to LeBron James. He was every bit the superstar that the other guys at the top of the league were at that point. He averaged 28 points, 10 rebounds, and 4 assists in that playoff run on 67% true shooting, which is ridiculous. But his shot making was just off the charts. 59% effective field goal percentage on catch and shoot jumpers in that playoff run. 45% effective field goal percentage on pull-up jump shots in that playoff run. 52% on runners and 78% at the rim. And it led to this super high level half court shot creation. It became a big deal for the Lakers that they could just dump the ball to Anthony Davis in the post with 7 seconds on the shot clock, and he was going to get a bucket basically 1 out of 2 times. As a matter of fact, he ran 198 ISOs and post-ups in that playoff run, scored 217 points, including passes. So just a ridiculous shot creation postseason for Anthony Davis. A ton of tough jump shots off the dribble, over both shoulders, off of different footwork and dribble combinations. He was just a huge part of what made the Lakers a championship team in that season. It was very much LeBron 1A, Anthony Davis 1B, which I think kind of sets him apart from some of his peers. Now, he hasn't been able to replicate that offensive success since that point, but it doesn't really matter. He did it long enough to get a Larry O'Brien trophy, and that makes you immortal, basically, in the history of the NBA. Biggest what if of Anthony Davis's career: what if in the 2020 season it didn't get stopped by COVID? And the reason why I say that is the Lakers, I thought, would have won the championship anyway. They started the season 24-3 that year. I thought they were clearly the best team in the league. They were the best team in the West. They had some issues with the Clippers earlier in the season, but they solved those issues right before the season got shut down. They took care of the Clippers in a game on the road, but in the Clippers arena. And then they had also beat the Bucks, and LeBron was like in a position where he was in a good spot to win MVP. I actually thought he should have won MVP that year. But then the season gets cut short. Now, why does that matter? Because I do believe they would have won the title anyway. And in a traditional offseason where Anthony Davis gets to rest, I think he comes into the following year in better shape, and I think he has better injury luck. But instead, there was this ridiculously quick turnaround. As a matter of fact, the Lakers hoisted the trophy on October 11th. And then on December 22nd, they were playing a regular season NBA game, with obviously training camp coming in a couple weeks before that. So they basically got like maybe 6 weeks off before they had to start playing basketball again. And I do think that Anthony Davis ended up taking most of that time off, as did most of the players on the Lakers. And I think that directly led to some of the injury issues that they dealt with in that particular season, which kind of spiraled over the course of the next couple years for AD. And I wonder sometimes if that 2020 season was more normal, if AD was in a traditional kind of routine that he had been in for the earlier seasons of his career. I wonder if he would have been healthier. Moving on to number 16, Jason Kidd. One-time NBA champion in 2011 as a role player for the Dallas Mavericks. Also a 2-time best player on a finals team with the New Jersey Nets in the early 2000s. 5-time first-team All-NBA, 6-time All-NBA in total, 9-time All-Defense. Led the league in assists 5 times. His prime I put down from 1996 to 2010. It's a ridiculously long prime. He made an All-Star team in 1996 and then made another All-Star team in 2010. 14.7 rebounds and 9 assists with 2 steals per game on 51% true shooting. 15, 7, and 9 with 2 steals in the playoffs on 50% true shooting. His claim to fame: he was one of the best defensive guards in the league during that era, but he was the master of the fast break. He was probably the very best player in the league at playing fast break basketball at that particular time. That New Jersey Nets team was super fun. They were super athletic. They had this ridiculous front line with Richard Jefferson and Kenyon Martin. They also had Kerry Kittles out there. They would just get stops and run the floor. They were the number 1 defense in the league in 2002 and in 2003, and they just got stops and they ran it down your throat. And Jason Kidd was like a really good athlete that would just go down the floor with crazy pace, and then if you didn't stop him, he was going all the way to the rim and laying it up. And if you did stop him, he just had massive control over the fast break to get easy dunks and layups in transition. He also he had this those of you guys who watched back in that era will remember he would kind of throw these one-arm passes up the floor, just like these rifle passes up the floor when guys would get ahead on the break. That was like the identity of the New Jersey Nets. They got stops and they ran in transition. They just ran it down your throat. From there, let's just skip ahead to the crowning achievement, and we'll come back to his archetype. So he was the best player on 2 NBA Finals teams, literally got within 2 wins of an NBA championship in 2003. He also finished second in MVP voting behind Tim Duncan in 2002. In that 2-year span, he averaged 17 points, 7 rebounds, and 9 assists, 20 points, 8 rebounds, and 9 assists in the playoffs. And they were actually down by 2 in Game 5 of the 2003 NBA Finals with 4.5 minutes left. and they just couldn't get it done. Steve Kerr hit a couple of big jump shots down the stretch of that game, and the Spurs ended up winning, and then they closed it out in 6. But they were pretty close relative to some other finals teams to actually getting the job done. And then after that, he had some knee issues and kind of lost his ceiling at that point, but we'll get to that in a minute. His archetype, just a huge guard, 6'4", 215 pounds. He was one of the best defenders in the league, really good defensive instincts, played passing lanes well, disrupted ball handlers. He was actually, a lot of people don't realize this, Jason Kidd is second all-time in NBA history in steals. He could switch and guard bigger players as well, famously did so to LeBron James in the 2011 NBA Finals at times. A decent half-court offensive player, got to the rim a lot. It was different than Chauncey Billups. He's very right-hand heavy, loved to drive to the right, liked to get all the way to the rim. Not much of a pull-up shooter. He took some and he made some, but not nearly as frequent a pull-up jump shooter as someone like Chauncey Billups was. He's good at drawing fouls. Like a lot of the big guards from that era, played a lot of post-up basketball. But again, he was at his best in transition. That was like his bread and butter. He was an inconsistent jump shooter early in his career, but he worked really hard at it and became basically a dead-eye jump shooter in catch-and-shoot situations by the tail end of his career, which turned him into a functional role player on a championship team. Something that, like, that's what I was kind of talking about with Russell Westbrook earlier. Like, when Jason Kidd had his knee injury and started to decline, he changed his game and became a player that could kind of change his role and fit within a championship context. As a matter of fact, in the 2010 season, Jason Kidd took over 400 catch-and-shoot jump shots and made them at a 65% effective field goal percentage. So that gives you an idea of the level of competency he built as a jump shooter towards the tail end of his career. Biggest what-if of Jason Kidd's career, in my opinion, is what if his knee held up? He had microfracture surgery in 2004, never really got back to what he was as an athlete after that. And the reason why that's interesting to me is the league was wide open during that stretch. From 2004 to 2008, we had 5 different NBA champions. And so it's interesting to think if he had held up, whether or not him and the Nets could have broken through one of those years. Number 15, Dwight Howard. NBA champion as a role player with the Lakers in 2020. Best player on a finals team in 2009 with the Orlando Magic. 5-time first-team All-NBA. 8 total All-NBA selections. 3-time Defensive Player of the Year. 5 times All-Defense. 5-time Rebounding Leader of the Year. A rebounding champion, whatever you want to call it. 2-time block leader for the NBA. His prime I put down is 2007 to 2014. In that span, he averaged 20 points and 13 rebounds to go with 2.3 blocks per game. In the playoffs, he averaged 20 points, 14 rebounds with 2.7 blocks per game. His claim to fame was he was the best center in the NBA during his prime. He had 4 consecutive top 5 MVP finishes. He was the runner-up for MVP in 2011. He had 51 games with 20 points and 20 rebounds. As a matter of fact, if you go back, I was using an AI platform for this, but if you go back to 1983 is basically the cutoff. Since 1983, nobody in the NBA has had more 2020 games than Dwight Howard. Anybody got a guess who's number 2? If you guessed Andre Drummond, you were correct. That's a random one for you. But Dwight was also the very best defensive player in the league and the best vertical spacer in the league. Iconically had a game-winning dunk on a sideline out of bounds lob in a regular season game in his early Magic career. His archetype, it's hard to describe. He was another unicorn. He was just a complete mountain of a man at his position. The way I would describe it is like the way that Giannis looks as a power forward, and it just doesn't even make sense to see him next to other power forwards. That's the way Dwight Howard looked next to other centers. He just was chiseled and filled out in a way that just was completely different than any other NBA player at that point. He's the very best defensive player in the league. He was a ridiculous rim protector. As a matter of fact, he's 13th on the all-time NBA blocks list, which is really impressive when you factor in the number of injuries that he dealt with. He's a pretty good post-up player, but never as good as he should have been. He had decent footwork. It's basically like he'd go through the lane with these sweeping hooks, so he'd kind of like go across the lane off of his left foot and take like a right-handed sweeping hook in the lane. Towards the baseline, it was more of a traditional footwork, kind of like Pau Gasol, where it's just drop step and then like a left-handed hook on the left block and a right-handed hook on the right block along the baseline. He had a decent spin move too. A really good power dribble where he just shut guys off with that left shoulder and send them flying and just rise up and dunk. A lot of you guys have seen, a half dozen or so crazy Dwight Howard post-up dunks. Good little hook shot. He made it just under half of the time. Not as sharp as he probably should have been with that shot, but he was pretty good with his hook shot. The thing that held him down was, in terms of his post-up efficiency, was he really struggled to make free throws, was consistently in the mid-50s, low 60s, right? And then he was never a good passer. And this is actually a crazy stat. Dwight Howard amassed 1,676 assists in his career to go with 3,302 turnovers, almost double. And so the turnovers and the missed free throws just kind of like hindered some of his success as a post player, despite having some okay footwork and a decent hook shot, right? So he was consistently below a point per possession in post-up situations and just not quite as good as his peers. His crowning achievement, you could go two different ways here. You could talk about his peak as a player, which I think was in 2011. He averaged 23 and 14 on 62% true shooting and finished second in the MVP race, but he lost in the first round. So you guys know I'm going to go with the playoff accomplishment. So I put Dwight's claim to fame his crowning achievement as the 2009 finals run. The 2009 Magic were a really fun team. They were the best defense in the league, anchored by Dwight Howard, but they had this really good offense that wasn't as centered around Dwight Howard as you would think. They did run a lot of post-ups for Dwight, but they were mainly a pick-and-roll team. They had these two really good pick-and-roll handlers in Jameer Nelson and Hedo Turkoglu, and they actually ran more pick-and-roll than anybody in the league that season, and a lot of it was just Dwight setting good screens, rolling hard to the rim. He was the best vertical spacer in the league at the time, and then they just had a ton of shooting. With Courtney Lee out there and with Rashard Lewis out there. Just everybody could shoot. They spaced the floor really well. It's kind of funny looking back because they were second in the league in three-pointers made that year with 817. To give you an idea, the Bulls made the fewest in the league this year at 854. So the second best three-point shooting team in 2009 would be the very worst three-point shooting team today, which goes to show you how much the league has changed. But they spread teams out. They got great looks in pick and roll, and they played great defense, and that was their identity. They upset the one-seed Cavs team in the Eastern Conference Finals, despite LeBron James averaging 39, 8 and 8 on 59% true shooting. But Dwight just absolutely obliterated Zydrunas Ilgauskas and Anderson Varejao. Averaged like 28 in the series. He had 40 points and 14 rebounds in Game 6. Knocked down most of his free throws. He was 12 for 16 from the line in that game too. But then he ran into the Lakers, and the Lakers just defended Dwight extremely well. They held him down to 15 points per game. Dwight also had 20 turnovers in 5 games. You can do the math there. And they ended up losing the series in 5 games. I wanted to shout out Dwight Howard for his late career here because he bounced around as weird. Like they had a couple decent years in Houston, right? He gets eliminated by that crazy Damian Lillard buzzard beater in 2014. Then they make it to the conference finals in 2015, but they get their butts kicked. But then he's all over the place. A year in Atlanta, a year in Charlotte. He did a year in Washington, but then he finally settles down in LA, this weird non-guaranteed contract. They tell him he's never going to start. He's going to come off the bench, even though he's better than JaVale McGee. Basically just like, we don't want to deal with any of your shit. So you can come here, but there's going to be all these stipulations. And to Dwight's credit, he fit in extremely well, was a great teammate, was a super important bench piece for the Lakers, ended up starting some key games for the Lakers in the postseason, was a huge defensive weapon against Nikola Jokic, ended up getting his contract guaranteed in the middle of the season, kind of as like a sign of the Lakers kind of buying into him and giving him that vote of confidence, and just was a really important piece for a very, very good NBA championship team in the 2020 Los Angeles Lakers. Was probably like their 6th or 7th best player on that team. Biggest what if of Dwight Howard's career. What if Courtney Lee makes the layup at the buzzer of Game 2 of the 2009 NBA Finals? So it was a really smart play design, right? Game's tied, I think, at 88. And they're inbounding from the opposite sideline. And Dwight's posting up Powell right in front of the passer, which pulls Powell into basically post defense, right? Like a 3-quarter front, which takes him away from the rim because Dwight's standing outside the block. Everybody else is kind of above the key. And Courtney Lee's at the top of the key, and Rashard Lewis actually comes up and sets a back screen on Kobe Bryant, who's guarding Courtney Lee. And because the rim was vacant and because Kobe didn't switch the screen like they probably should have, Courtney Lee ends up getting a pretty good look at the rim on a lob pass, and he smokes it. But even crazier, if you actually remember in that game on the previous possession in a late shot clock situation, Courtney Lee actually drives into the lane and misses another layup, a little right-handed scoop shot. Both of these were tough shots. I don't want to act like they were 100% layups. They weren't. Both of them were probably like layups you'd miss 1 out of 3 times, but it's crazy because you have a 2 in 3 chance of making it, and you get 2 chances at it, and he misses them both. And if he makes one of them, they have a very good chance to go up 2-1 in the series, and then who knows what happens from there. Number 14, Allen Iverson, one of our 2 remaining players who has not won an NBA championship. Again, shout out to Munib 2001 who guessed the 2 players correct in Steve Nash and Allen Iverson. He was the best player on a finals team in 2001, 3-time first-team All-NBA, 7-time All-NBA total selections, 4-time scoring champion, and a 3-time steals leader in the NBA. He won the 2001 regular season MVP award as well. His prime I put down from 1999 to 2008. In that stretch, he averaged 29 points, 4 rebounds, and 6 assists on 52% true shooting. In the playoffs, 30 points, 4 rebounds, and 6 assists on 49% true shooting. We'll talk about efficiency in a minute because I think that's a big thing that kind of colors Allen Iverson's career that I want to dive into a little bit. Allen's claim to fame. I thought he was the very best scorer of the early 2000s and probably the second best scorer of that entire era behind Kobe Bryant. In fact, if you pull up total points, if you look just at the window of Iverson's prime from 1999 to 2008, he was second in total points behind Kobe with 19,443. Anybody got a guess who's third place? Again, Kobe's first. They're going from 99 to 08. Kobe's first, Allen Iverson second. Anybody got a guess for third place? If you guess Dirk, you are correct. Fourth place, I'll be really surprised if anybody can get this. Paul Pierce was fourth in scoring over that span. His archetype, he was just this ridiculous shifty guard. I thought he had the best crossover in the NBA at the time, the sweeping right to left. And it's funny because every kid has been trying to copy that crossover forever. Even Kobe basically copied that crossover. It's funny. This is going to be one of the big themes with Allen Iverson. He just had such great influence on basketball culture during this era. He basically invented high volume pull-up shooting. He had this crazy arsenal of traditional pull-ups and these drifting little leaners and fadeaways in the lane. He was really good at generating close pull-up jump shots to the rim. Here's how ahead of the game Allen Iverson was as a pull-up jump shooter. In 2005, which is as far back as Synergy goes with their tracking, Iverson attempted 672 pull-up jump shots. Second most in the league was Tracy McGrady with 451. So Allen Iverson attempted 221 more pull-up jump shots than anybody else in the entire NBA during that season. Even crazier, here's how ahead of the game he was. His 672 attempts in pull-up jump shots would have ranked second in the NBA this year behind DeMar DeRozan. So just kind of invented the idea of a guard just taking a ton of pull-up jump shots as he would find openings off the dribble. He's also a freaky athlete in his younger years. A lot of people forget about that. I would say that there is a decent argument to be made that nobody in this era, in this list of, other than maybe Steph Curry, nobody in this list from 1999 to 2023 influenced the game of basketball as much as Allen Iverson. Again, my generation, people that are in their, I would say anybody who's in their early 30s, between 30 and 35, you guys, if you're from that group, Allen Iverson just was the guy we all wanted to be like. Everyone wanted to look like him on the court. We copied his moves. We copied his dribble combinations and his footwork. It's just what we did. His crowning achievement, he was the best player on a finals team in 2001. The 2001 Sixers were a really interesting team because they were top 5 defense in the league, anchored by Dikembe Mutombo. And they also had just a ton of athleticism around him. Aaron McKee and Tyrone Hill were important wings on that team. Eric Snow was one of the very best defensive guards in the league on that particular team, kind of took a lot of the point of attack assignments that Allen Iverson didn't want to take. And basically they got stops and they let Allen Iverson cook. They won a ton of games that way. They were the 1 seed in the conference. They won a couple of hard-fought series against Vince Carter's Raptors and against Ray Allen's Bucks. And then they ran into one of the greatest teams of all time in the 2001 Lakers. But as you guys remember, he drops 48 points in Game 1 of the NBA Finals, that iconic stepping over Tyronn Lue shot. Sixers end up winning in OT. And then the Lakers win 4 straight because the Lakers were one of the best teams of all time. And I think they were undefeated in the Western Conference that year. They didn't really have much of a chance. It's very similar to LeBron in Game 1 of the 2018 NBA Finals. But that shot and step over, that pullback dribble, jump shot with Ty Lue on the ground and the step over, that's one of the most iconic moments in NBA history. Just another big thing that kind of helps color the imprint that Allen Iverson had on the NBA during that era. Biggest what if for me, for an Allen Iverson, is what if he played in this era? Allen Iverson suffers from an even worse case of like retroactive revisionist history than Kobe Bryant does. And the main reason why is the using of efficiency to compare straight across with players from this era when the game is very different, and using that to undermine what they accomplished. You got to remember, like the league in general had almost no shooting on the floor and was just completely clogged, and there was no space to operate. That was already what it was like. It was especially like that on those Sixers teams that were very defensive minded. And so Allen Iverson was forced to constantly take and make incredibly difficult shots. And so his percentages suffered for that. You can tell by just looking at the rest of that era and all of the scores, and all of the scores were relatively low efficiency compared to the scores of this era. But that's just how the game has changed. With Allen Iverson's quickness, his athleticism early in his career, his handle and his jump shooting, and his basketball IQ, if I picked him up today and I dropped him on the Oklahoma City Thunder instead of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, he's going to be as efficient as Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Like, that's the gap that we have to bridge with these conversations, is you can't go apples to apples comparison over two eras. You have different players on the floor, which leads to different spacing. The rules were interpreted slightly differently in those eras. The pace of the game was different. Also, just like, again, you have to understand, like, you're only capable of operating with the information that's available to you at the time, right? Like, now we know there's a ton of value in three-point shooting, and so we take a lot of threes. But back then, it just wasn't something that the league was very interested in. I read to you guys the three-point attempt numbers earlier when we were talking about the Magic. So, like, it just was a different era. So you got to look at it within the scope of that particular era. And again, say what you want about the efficiency, even relative to his peers. That was a Sixers team that depended on him to take incredibly difficult shots, and that's what he had to do. And so I hope that, that's what I meant as the what if. If Allen Iverson played in today's era, he would have been way more efficient, and I wonder if he would have been looked at more positively compared to his peers. All right, guys, that is all we have for today. We'll be back tomorrow with 13, 12, 11, and then we're heading into one player a day for the next 2 weeks. As always, I sincerely appreciate you guys, and I will see you tomorrow.